Bacchus has been hit by a tornado.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final instalment of our three-part webinar series on spring livestock killers, presented to you by Northern Tablelands Local Land Services. My name is Tahnee Manton, and I'm a Livestock Officer with Northern Tablelands LLS based in Glen Innes and servicing the entire Northern Tablelands region. Our topic for this evening is worms in livestock. Just before we get the webinar underway, we'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping. So there will be a control panel. It should be up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. There's a red arrow button on the left of that control panel, which collapses and reinstates it. You should hear us, but we are unable to hear you. So as we go through the presentation tonight, please type your questions into the question box. And I will relay those questions to our panelists throughout the course of the webinar tonight. So again, like our previous two webinars, we're going to run this in a quite a relaxed conversation type style. So rather than a formal presentation, so please get those questions through to us so we can answer those for you. The webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to you in the coming days. And there's also several handouts tonight, which you can download at any point throughout this webinar, but they will also be in the email you receive after this webinar. So tonight's presenters, I'd like to introduce Andrew Biddle. Andrew is the District Vet with Northern Tablelands LLS based in Inverell. Nigel Brown. Nigel is the DV based in Glen Innes. Leanne Polsen, who is the DV, who's our new DV based in Armidale, and Lisa Martin, who is the DV with NTLLS based in Tenterfield. So thank you all for joining me tonight. Firstly, before we get going, we've got a couple of polls that we would like to ask. So the first one is, do you undertake fecal egg counts? So I'll give you just a little bit of time to answer that question. So we've got a fair few votes coming through now. So another 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So we've got quite a large portion that don't do any at all, with 18% both for yes. Some do it themselves and some send it to the lab. So our next poll is, do you have drench resistance on your property? So we'll leave that one open for about 10 seconds or so. Got about half the audience voted now. And I'll close that in 3, 2, 1. So we can see there's almost 60% don't know. And around 10% of our audience say yes, they do have drench resistance on their property. So I guess the first thing that we'd like to touch on tonight is the life cycle of worms and even fluke that affect livestock. So Nigel, can we talk about that for a little bit first off?
Yes, sure. Surely, if I put myself off mute. Essentially, worms are going to lay eggs, whatever the worm, and those eggs are going to hatch. But then there are different life cycles depending on which species of worm. So if we take your round worms, So your barber's pole, your strongars, your black scour, your stomach worms, they're going to be a single life cycle. The larvae hatch out of the eggs in the dung on the ground. They go through a series of stages. The tiny little larvae that come out get caught on the grass in bits of water, and then they clamber up the grass in the water with the sunlight, and then they get eaten by the cow or the sheep or other species. And that's then they mature, they lodge in whichever part of the body they're going to be lodging. And then when they reach maturity, usually about 3 weeks, they start laying eggs again. You do in some of our species, like the brown stomach and even the barber's pole, you do get some, as we're indicating in that diagram, which will lodge in the stomach wall for several months. They'll rest there until the conditions are right, and then they'll restart their development into adulthood. And so that's the straightforward one. The liver fluke, stomach fluke as well are subtly different. They have two animals or hosts, and the adult lays the eggs, they come out in the feces, but then the little larvae that come out enter into a water snail, and that water snail then releases particles that go onto the pasture, onto grass or plants, and then those plants are eaten by the sheep or cow or whatever, and that releases them. There are subtly different lifestyles for tapeworms, and not that we find they're a major problem, except for hydatid, and I think we'll come to that one later. But it's essential to know that larvae are mostly on the pasture, and that is where the most worms, in inverted commas, are on your enterprise. And that's critical to understanding the dynamics of a worm infestation of your livestock, in my opinion.
And what about in terms of the life cycle of worms and fluke? Temperature obviously plays a part in that as well, Andrew?
Look, absolutely. Obviously the temperature inside the animal for the adult fluke, that doesn't change a lot. But when you look at those stages of the life cycle that Nigel's been talking about, any time that those eggs and larvae are outside of the animal, that's when the environment, whether it be temperature or just dry weather and desiccation, that's when, or drying out, that's when the environment can either positively or negatively impact the worms. Take the season we're looking at now, with it getting warmer, and with there being the rain around that we're seeing today. Any of those eggs that are being laid by those adult worms in the animal, they're getting out there. They're basically going into their version of the Garden of Eden. It's just what they're wanting. So the survival in those eggs to become larvae is going to be really, most of them are going to survive there, and so the numbers of worm eggs that then become larvae that then become adults and back in those animals is rapidly increasing, because you're not getting the drying out or the effect of cold weather that's actually limiting the survival of those worm eggs and worm larvae. So that's why this spring, barber's pole worm in particular, is going to be a killer of animals.
Yeah, absolutely. And this season is obviously shaping up to be, a real perfect conditions for worms. What are some of the signs of worms in our livestock, Leanne, that people can look out for?
So I guess the thing to keep in mind is that most of our animals carry a degree of parasites at all times, and most of them are normal and some of them look fantastic. But as these infections start to increase, we'll start to see some signs. Initially, they'll be subclinical, so they won't be that obvious. It might be a reduction in appetite, reduction in performance, and it may be a reduction in reproductive performance. But as that infection takes over, you'll start to see things like the images on our screen here now. So you'll have ill thrift, you'll have some diarrhea, anemia. I think we've got some pictures of that as well. So instead of that nice pink fleshy colour, we've got that pale colour, the conjunctiva around the eye and the mucous membranes there. And then on the next slide, we've got some bottle jaw as well. So definitely things to keep an eye out for coming into the spring. So there are a number of diseases that can sort of replicate these clinical signs, both viral and bacterial. So your history and your management is going to play a large part in us diagnosing worms as a problem.
And that's a great point, Leanne, because you know, there are obviously some other things that it could be. So bottle jaw obviously always doesn't necessarily means, you know, a worm or a fluke infestation, but it can be, of course, other things, Lisa, can't it?
Well, that's right, Tahnee. There's you know, plenty of other things that can mimic the signs that you'll see with worms. So, you know, bottle jaw often when you've got hyperproteinemia, when you've got poor nutrition, we were used to seeing that in the drought. You'd often see that with the livestock, and it wasn't the worms being the problem then. And similarly, you know, anemia can have other causes. You can, you know, Theileria, which is a blood parasite, you know, some of the tick fevers, they can all cause that pale mucous membranes and gums. So yeah, a lot of things, bacterial infections, you can get other gut parasites that can cause scours. So, you know, probably one of the most important things is that you should be monitoring your stock. And as we indicated with that poll earlier on, doing some fecal egg counts is a great way to start to see whether you've got worms, and you could be monitoring your herd to see if they're a cause of production loss or disease, potential disease or not.
So, Nigel, did you want to comment further on that?
No, I totally agree with Lisa and indeed my colleagues. We have to use a bit of science in this. My eyes, even when I was younger, couldn't see worm eggs in a shit sample. Sorry, am I allowed to use that word? What we have to do is to look down a microscope for them. It's very, very simple to do. You don't need 5 years at college to be able to see them down there. And we all do trainings courses for our ratepayers to show them how to use it. The costs make it of buying a microscope and a slide and then a bit of salt water is all you need. And you can get the answer in 10 minutes. I did one this morning for somebody with a diarrhea cow. Absolutely no eggs there, but I was able to do that in about less than 5 minutes. And I've got a lot more strength to suggest that it's something and it's not parasites. But also, if you send these samples away, you've got a vagaries at the post, and it takes so long to get them there and back. It's so much more convenient to be able to get the sample almost before breakfast and then treat or do whatever you have to do after breakfast the same day. And it's not rocket science. It's very, very simple, very, very cost effective, and it allows you to have much more accuracy in your management programs.
And that's a really good point, and hopefully, you know, COVID depending, of course, but we do, as Nigel says, run some you know, fecal egg counting courses for ratepayers. So hopefully we can get some of those up and going in the near future. But that's a really good lead on to my next question, if you like, about how do we reduce some of the negative impact of worms. So obviously fecal egg counts and monitoring is one way. Andrew, do you want to comment further on that?
Yeah, look, absolutely. If we've got 3 or 4 hours, I should be able to get what I'm saying. There were some particularly insightful comments, but basically there's a lot of information, so we will touch on it now and encourage you, if you've got questions about how to manage worms on your property, make contact with us and we can actually come up with advice that relates to your particular enterprise, what the whether you're up on the tablelands or further out onto the slopes, because it will subtly change what you do. But yes, I think the first thing you need to do is monitor and actually know that that you are dealing with a worm problem. You're not dealing with something where drenching is not going to be beneficial and you need to be looking towards other things. I think the next thing that's really important is make sure you're using an effective drench. We previously, we asked you a question about whether you think you've got drench resistance on your property. If you have drench resistance and you're using a product that doesn't work, it's not going to kill worms. If it's not going to kill worms, the problem that those animals have got is going to continue to happen. It's important to drench, to be strategic with your grazing, taking into consideration the worms that are potentially on the pasture. Nigel, pointed out at the start of this presentation that the majority of the worms in that whole of life cycle are on the pasture as eggs or as larvae. So it's not just about looking at the worms in the sheep, it's about looking at the worms in the sheep and on the pasture. Looking at things like spelling paddocks, where you've got paddocks where you believe there is a high worm burden, putting classes of stock or species on there that are less susceptible to those worms, so that you can bring those worm numbers down and therefore bring more susceptible species back on later. Nutrition is really important. And simple things like your drenching technique. It's really important. Once you've worked out that you're going to use a drench that kills the worms, make sure that you read the label. That's one of my favourite things to provide as advice to people. Read the label, have a look what the dose is meant to be, weigh your animals so that you're actually giving the correct dose, and then make sure that your drenching gun is actually delivering the correct dose, so that at the end of the day, you provide the correct drench, you put it in the right place so that it can do the job that needs to be done. So look, there are other things like there are vaccines now available that provide an option other than traditional drenching, and there's also genetics where there are estimated breeding values, certainly in sheep, so that if you're using that as part of your selection process, you can actually make genetic improvement by selecting rams that have been selected based on their worm output when they're exposed to a burden of worms. That's 2-hour presentation in 2 minutes.
That's the short of it. So we would definitely encourage anybody that's joining us tonight to pick up the phone and call us and have a chat about that, because it is a rather large topic and it does take a long time to get through. So we're really just skimming the surface here, I guess. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through. So this one's from Lucy, and Nigel, I'll point this in your direction. How big does the microscope have to be able to see the eggs? Nigel, you're just on mute there. We'll just have to unmute you.
That makes me feel better to have not been the only person to do that tonight. Thank you, Nigel.
You are now unmuted. Thank you. I think the essence of that is that you've got, because the slide that you're using to to measure it has some scratches on it, deliberate markings. You want to get the size that fits across, and usually this is about 400 in the combination, but I can give you the details of where to get the microscopes and the slides. Andrew could, any of us could. Contact us on that one, please, Lucy.
Okay, so we've got another question here as well. Andrew, I'll point this in your direction. How much value is there for positive, and I'm assuming breeding values for muscle and fat in sheep in terms of worm resistance?
Wow, I would have to take that one on notice. That's well outside my comfort zone. I can certainly follow up on that, and we can provide that information. But off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to give you any accurate information on that one.
Okay, and we've got another question here. Is Poron suitable for worming, or is an oral drench better, Lisa?
I'll just unmute myself and not make it 3 in a row. Look, I think everyone's pretty confident that oral or injectable is probably a bit better than Poron, but everyone knows Poron's so much easier, and it really depends on your facilities. I guess the good thing about Poron is plenty of, so long as you're doing more than one animal, they're probably going to lick a bit off and take it orally as well. So, you know, I think the majority of stock are probably getting done with Poron just because it's easier. But, you know, if they get rained on, you underdose, a whole pile of other things, that's going to be a problem. But similarly, if you're doing oral dosing and they spit it all out, that's not going to work that well either. So, and a lot of people don't have the facilities to easily inject big numbers, or if they do, they need to do it, you know, properly and aseptically and all of those things, normal practice for giving injections. So, yeah, it's a bit of a debate, but it's easier. Nigel's going to say something there.
Yeah, if I may, I just think this is one of those wonderful advantages of just being able to do your own worm egg counting, because week, 10 days, 14 days after you've drenched, you can go back and collect a dung sample from the paddock and look at it down the microscope. And if you're getting worm eggs there, they can't, because of the life cycle, they can't have been produced by any larvae that have been eaten since the drenching. So it means they must have come from worms that were in the gut at the time of drenching, and therefore you've either not given enough or you've got drench resistance. Simple as that.
Yep. That's right.
So, and we've got another great question that's come through from Emily, and she asked, when should we be doing these fecal egg counts? Should we take them again after treating and to check for resistance? And if yes, how long after treatment do they take them, Nigel?
Okay, so yes, absolutely spot on. Great question. All questions are great, but that one's really spot on with what we were saying. I tend to recommend about 10 days for cattle, 10 to 14 days for cattle and for sheep, as being the window of opportunity. The life cycle is going to take you approximately for your roundworms 21 days, varies a bit with the temperature. But because, as we've said, there's a lot of larvae on the ground, I'm not actually a great one for taking worm eggs back to a zero count all the time. So as soon as I see any of them, there are certain cutoff points where, depending on the season, depending on the worms, there are different levels at which you think, oh, that's significant. So sometimes I'll be saying to people, look, I found, let's say 300 eggs per gram. I think they're Barber's pole. In these older weathers, I'd be saying, let's check again in a month's time. Or I might say, oh, these are young lambs. They're 50 eggs per gram, but the season is warm and wet and there's going to be heaving with larvae. Let's check them again in a couple of weeks' time. And if people are doing it themselves, they can do it to their own heart's content and find out what the pattern is and what suits them. And 1 year is going to be different from another, but different categories of stock have different cut-off points and different levels of need for repeating testing.
And I think the other thing to add in there, Tahnee, people need to think about when they're doing those fecal egg count. Obviously, when they're doing them in cattle versus sheep, you know, as we know, cattle dung can really vary markedly in the water content of that that feces, and it you know, whereas sheep tend to be pellets or a bit firmer. So you've got to adjust a little bit when we're talking eggs per gram. There could be a lot of water sometimes in those cattle pats compared to, say, in a drought on high fibrous nutrition.
Yep, absolutely, great point. It's finding that standardization for your own property, your own technique. That's what gives you the reliability of the testing. Spot on, Lisa.
And that's some really great advice, and you know, that's certainly in terms of, you know, reducing the negative impact and that whole integrated worm management concept is, you know, that monitoring those fecal egg counts are certainly really important. So we might just move on from that and keep rolling, because we're quickly running out of time. But drench resistance, Leanne, if I could start with you on this one. So what are some of the things that can be done to, I guess, try and combat that drench resistance?
So we find resistance quite individual to each property, and it's based on what's been used in the past. This is probably a question I'll pass over to Andrew, because he's written a paper a few years ago about this particular topic, and that's relevant to our area.
Yeah, look, I certainly don't profess to be an expert on it, but yes, I've been around the tablelands for a while now, and certainly, particularly in sheep, the amount of drench resistance to most of the active ingredients in drenches out there, it's very rare to find a property that doesn't have resistance. And plenty of people sort of say, oh, we just don't use those products anymore, and that's, you know, almost invariably because of resistance. But yeah, we have, you know, we've had, you know, new actives come along, things like monopantal and StarTech and things like that, Zolvix, you know, giving us these new products that you know, arrive on the market with very little resistance. Every time you use a drench, you start the process of developing resistance, because it's genetic. So when worms survive the drench, they then make up the largest proportion of the population that remain in the animal. They then produce eggs that genetically have resistance, and so you get this incremental rise in worms that carry the genetics for resistance. So every time you drench, you get more resistance. So going back to our themes earlier about monitoring and only drenching when you need to drench, the less times you drench, the slower the development of resistance is, and the longer it's going to be before you've got resistance. One of the things that I think is really important on all properties is don't introduce resistance unnecessarily. If you're purchasing animals, and this doesn't matter whether it's cattle or sheep or goats or anything else, don't bring up resistance onto your property on the truck by buying a mob of sheep and then just bringing them in and putting them straight out with your animals. You basically immediately take the resistance profile from the previous property and spread it amongst your animals. Yeah, hold them in the yards. Use one or a number of effective drenches. It may seem like overkill at the start to drench them a number of times, but by doing that, you're not going to run the risk of bringing on resistant worms that you otherwise wouldn't have had. So it's a short-term cost potentially for a long-term benefit.
Absolutely, and I think even as we were discussing yesterday between us, and even right down to clean boots, because if you're carrying manure on your boots, you can also introduce resistant worm eggs onto a property as well, which is not ideal either. So certainly really, really important stuff. So that's sort of got us to the time tonight. That half an hour went quick. I'm sure you'll all agree. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining me tonight to talk about worms. I'm sure everybody's got some very useful information from that session. If you'd like to talk further, again, please contact us. We can again, have a chat over the phone, arrange a farm visit, anything like that. And certainly any of those questions are like on microscopes and things, like please call us and we can certainly point you in the right direction. So there will be a short survey pop up after you shut this webinar page, so that'll launch about 15 seconds afterwards. So we would greatly appreciate your time to fill that out for us. That will help us sort of direct some future events and things like that. Thank you for your attendance tonight. We hope you have enjoyed this webinar on worms, and if you've joined us for our previous 2 webinars, we hope you have enjoyed the Spring Livestock Killers webinar series. So thank you again. We hope you're getting some rain wherever you are. Stay safe and good night.